So welcome everyone to, I think Bertha is recording, so just for transparency's sake, thank you. Um, Welcome everybody to our Brown Bag Talk for 28th of March, 2022. And today we have Dr. Sally Baker, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Education, teaching and at the University of, sorry, at the University of New South Wales, Australia. She has her teaching and her research interests are centered on language literacies and transitions in equity in higher education, which is right up our alley here at the Higher Education and Human Development Group. She's particularly interested in culturally and linguistically diverse students, refugee students in particular. Sally is the chair of the National Refugee Education Special Interest Group for with students of refugee backgrounds, supported by the Refugee Council of Australia. And Dr. Carmen Martinez Vargas will be our discussant for today's event, as I am the chair. I wanted to mention that I met Sally last year, I think, after somebody at our partner group, research group, the ISG group, shared a call for participants, and I found her research very interesting and really something that I think all of us should be discussing. So I'm looking forward to today's talk. Welcome, Sally.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Excuse the weird lighting. It's because it's 9 p.m. here, it's dark, and I've got two sets of lights, so I think I look a bit lit up here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this evening. Or this morning, or lunchtime. I'm going to hope to share my screen. Can you see my screen at the moment?
Not yet.
No. Teams and I are. Okay, let me just try this. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So,
yes.
So my what I'm going to talk to you today about is the topic of a book that I am trying to write, trying and failing, and I think trying and failing because of some of the conditions that I'm going to talk to this evening in the presentation. And I expect that I will be teaching everybody in the group to suck eggs, in the sense that I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about is quite intuitive. And so this question of whether universities are caring institutions is almost always met with a resolute no. And why would we even think about that being the case? But I'm increasingly pulled towards the idea of care because I find it hard to care for myself. I find myself engaging in some behaviours that I think we're forced into in the academy, competitive, self-promoting activities. I find them deeply uncomfortable, as I'm sure many people in the room do as well. And all sorts of other things, but certainly COVID in particular magnified so many things that felt uncaring, or at the very least undercaring, in terms of being someone who works and at a university. And I believe it's very similar for people who study at universities and for people who are connected with universities. And so it felt pressing to ask this question. But before I move on, I would like to first acknowledge that I am meeting you this evening from the beautiful lands of the Awabakal people here in Newcastle, New South Wales in Australia. I acknowledge the Aboriginal nations as the first peoples of Australia, and I thank them for their custodianship of the land and waters and the air that we breathe. It's a great honour to live on this land that was stolen and is unceded, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Australia more than ever needs a treaty to move towards the kinds of reparations and parity, recognition and respect that has not and continues to not be extended to the First Nations people of Australia. In particular, I acknowledge the Berrigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work, which is UNSW Sydney in Kensington. and I want to extend my warmest respects to anyone who identifies as being Indigenous or First Nations here today. And I think the acknowledgement of country is an important piece in the puzzle. I know it's a different context in South Africa, but similar colonial logics play out, and I want to acknowledge from the off that I am from the colonizing heritage and that I hold a whole lot of privilege that is that allows me to ask these kinds of questions. When I've been writing the book, I've kind of sat with a lot of discomfort a lot of the time. I don't like writing this book on my own. I prefer to write with others. And I'm not sure that I'm the right person to write this book. I think there's a fair amount of imposter syndrome that continues to plague me, as it does many, and it disproportionately plagues women. But care became increasingly kind of prevalent and pressing for me because I wrote a book with a colleague looking at higher education and the experiences of students from refugee backgrounds and the ways that really key assumptions that frame higher education in Australia, at least, relating to cultural familiarity, relating to language proficiency, but only obviously in English because it is the only code that is recognised in a country like Australia, which has hundreds, if not thousands, of languages it could choose from. When writing about that particular cohort in that particular context, and it's obviously a piece that I continue to do a lot of advocacy in. At one point we wrote in that book, and I was speaking about it afterwards, about how to care felt like it was a radical act, to care for this particular cohort, to care about widening participation and access, to care about issues relating to language and how it marginalises students. And that's my background as a adult English language teacher, always working with people who are new to the country that I was living in, either the UK or in Australia, and the very powerful kind of spaces that English language classrooms can be. And then coming into the university space where language is not recognised as being plural, is taken for granted, and is responsibility for language is passed over to the student. That seems particularly problematic when we think about new arrivals in a country like Australia, a rich, resource-rich country that kind of is outsourcing its responsibility to individuals as part of the neoliberal agenda, which is no different, I'm sure, in the context in which you work. So I started to think about care because it felt like it was important. I also started to think about care because I knew that I wasn't taking good care of myself and was prone to burnout. And I wonder if that's something that you recognise in yourself as well. I think as academics, and particularly academic magpies, so people who are interested in shiny new ideas, it's easy to take on too much. It's easy to take on too much that doesn't count as well. So care for me kind of felt like it sat in that space, because in other jobs, earlier jobs, move in university space in Australia, I didn't always have an academic job, and I had sessional posts and fixed term posts. And I was working a lot with a particular group of refugee students who I'd met in another context, and was doing a lot of what felt like care work, a lot of emotional labour to support them in their desires to further their education, but knowing that there would be challenges, and there were challenges. That's a different project. I won't go into that this evening, but happy to answer questions. And so I started to think a bit more about care, and a lot of the literature on care, where it exists in the educational context, really looks at schools. And if it does look at higher education, it looks at it very narrowly in the teaching relationship. And obviously that's a key site of care in the interactions that we have between students and educators. But school is considered to be a space for care, largely because schools are predominantly staffed, certainly primary schools, predominantly staffed by women. They get taken up in ways that kind of connect with maternal notions of care. And Nell Noddings is a really important writer in this space who based her theory of care on the familial/maternal relationship. Universities, in contrast, are not considered to be spaces for care. They're generally considered to be masculine spaces. And there's a kind of extension of a critique, certainly, but maybe a justification for why care doesn't kind of happen in the university space because of that dichotomous gendered kind of notion, which is obviously hot garbage because universities are also spaces for care. Any space where there is relationship, where there is a kind of reciprocity at play, may not be a balanced reciprocity, but where there's an expectation of people giving and taking, of caring for and caring with, caring about and being cared for, then it's not okay to write that off in the university space on the basis of it being a masculine or an independent or a more agentic space. Another reason for thinking about care in the context of higher education is that universities are a public good. They may get taken up in ways that look very similar to private companies and to corporate entities, but essentially at the heart, given that many universities in Australia, the majority of universities are public universities in the sense that they are at least part funded by the state, that makes them a public good. And the knowledge that we as academics, as educators and students produce is part of a collective commons. Now, of course, in all sorts of ways, we try to commodify that knowledge and we try to mark ways around it to produce metrics that help us to compete in competitive international rankings. But at the heart, and it's a question that's not fully resolved in terms of what are universities a public good, there is a sense that universities are at least partially a public good. Another reason for thinking about care in the context of higher education is that education is taken to be a social mobiliser. There's plenty of literature in the equity or widening participation space that kind of critiques some of that idea because it's based on ideas about shared understandings of agentic capacity, the capacity to be able to make decisions for yourself, and assumes that everyone has free and even access to information and other resources, which we know for an absolute solid fact is not the case. But when universities engage in equity or widening participation, if they're doing it as a competitive activity so that they can use the discourses and rhetoric of diversity and equity as sales pitches for their recruitment piece, or if these kinds of activities, and in Australia we have activities such as the Athena Swan exercise. I'm not sure if that's also the name of it in South Africa, but that's really a compliance activity for institutions to be able to tick boxes to demonstrate their professed excellence in particular areas that would come under the equality or equity or access or diversity or inclusion agenda. And so if we're not thinking about it beyond this compliance piece, then care becomes eroded, and it might become eroded to the point where care doesn't exist. But really, more than anything else, COVID has exposed the magnitude of the challenges that many people struggle with on a daily basis. So things like the digital divide, things like students having to share devices or not having access to unlimited Wi-Fi or any Wi-Fi, using their phones to try and undertake study, living in cramped conditions with many other family members, not finding space and time to be able to move out. So the kinds of extremes of COVID in the lockdowns in particular have exposed the assumptions that many people bring, that universities, and when I talk about universities, I'm obviously talking about people, but it's easy for me to describe them as an institution in the same way it is for the institution to think about students as a homogenous group. That people in universities make decisions based on a whole set of assumptions that aren't actually reflective of the needs of many, many people, both staff and students, who work and study in universities and who have all sorts of challenges that are not just created but also exacerbated by the assumptions that are brought. And those assumptions, again, going back to my other work with students from refugee backgrounds, are largely about familiarity with systems, navigational capacity, digital literacies, academic language and literacies, which are often in development. In fact, they're in development for all of us, no matter where we are in our study or our career. If we think about these things in skills-based, linear-based, simplistic ways, they then constrain the capacity to do what we might call care, which is thinking a bit more holistically about what we do in higher education and where we all have a role to play. So I wanted to think about this idea because Joan Tronto, who is a really foundational thinker in this idea of sociology of care, wrote a really excellent article in 2010, which asked a question of whether how institutions can be caring, or what are the conditions that create non-caring institutions or organisations. And so I guess one of the kinds of things that's really troubled me while working on this project is the idea of, like, why would you even ask this question? Of course, universities are not caring. They're a thing, they're an institution, they're a corporation, they're an organisation. So reading Joan Tronto's work has kind of pushed my thinking beyond that, I imagine, a fear-based response with the responsibility of writing a book. And she asked whether, what are the kind of conditions that can create caring or careful institutions. She noted this against the backdrop of neoliberal ideology, so the responsibilization, individualization of things that we take to be maybe social or democratic processes or social resources. So universities are, of course, not immune to this neoliberal imaginary, and are often run in ways that are marketized and competitive and really challenging in a really challenging way. They're also, in the same way that the government might try to reduce responsibility of the individual onto the state, they also try to pass responsibility from the institution onto the student, as I've already mentioned, in terms of, you know, looking for your own support if you don't know how to reference, or seeking to make, having to make appointments to speak to people for help through online systems, which create additional barriers, and which, you know, if you're a cynic like me, you can't help but wonder if that's a deliberate strategy to stop people from actually accessing the support, because if it's not accessed, then the institution can make a justification for getting rid of those services. And sadly, we've seen that a lot in COVID. I imagine it's the same in the South African context as well, that of all the jobs that were cut, it was mostly the support roles, or the student-facing roles that went first, and they were disproportionately the jobs of women. So Joan Tronto came up with 7 signs that organisations or institutions may be uncaring, and she asked these questions about. It's really about assessing needs. So care might not be the right word, and I'll come to that in a little bit, but what we're really thinking about when we're asking this question of whether an institution is caring is thinking about, how does it understand its own needs, and how does it negotiate these needs? Which needs are taken to be legitimate? How are responsibilities allocated? Who actually gives the care and who actually receives the care? And not seeing it perhaps as a one-directional piece. So really, when we're thinking about care, we're thinking about the needs of another being met by another, so that when we try to care, we suspend part of ourselves to meet the other where they are, to respond, to assess what their needs are, and to create responses to meet that person's needs. But we don't do it ourselves. It's in relationship, and it's negotiated. So Tronto came up with seven signs of institutions not caring well, and I thought these were really interesting, and so I've been playing with these ideas as I kind of work on the book. So the first sign is that misfortune necessitates care, so that care is always a reactive component or practice. The second sign is that needs are taken for granted. The third is that care is a commodity, or seen to be a commodity, and that it can be commodified rather than a process in which we're all involved. The fourth sign is that care receivers are excluded from making decisions on the basis of perceived vulnerability. The fifth sign is that care is reduced to caregiving. The fifth is that care is reduced to caregiving. The sixth is that caregivers see organisational barriers rather than facilitators. And that finally, and this will probably resonate for many of us, that care work is distributed along gendered, class and ethnic lines. And this connects really strongly with the work of Ali Hochschild, who's done a lot of work on care chains, looking at how global patterns of labour are distributed, and ultimately come down to this idea that you can buy care, that you can not only buy care, but you can buy yourself out of your responsibility to care. So taking that first sign, I thought about what this means at universities. I'm really interested in feedback, by the way. I haven't really kind of got the ideas quite tight, so I'd really appreciate any ideas or suggestions you have, and maybe I'm a bit off, or it doesn't make sense for you in your context, in which case please do let me know. So the first one, this idea of misfortune necessitating care, from my observation, and it may be different for you, universities create care as a response to misfortune. So universities take a very reactive stance to care as opposed to a proactive stance to care. And a current example in the Australian context is an ongoing issue, problem, challenge, disaster with sexual misconduct on campus, which resulted from a report that was released at least 4 years ago, I believe it was 2018, about hazing on campus, and talking about kind of ritualized sexual harassment cases on campus. That was one report, and the other report was about sexual violence on campus and the prevalence of attacks and the lack of action from universities. And so this has been going on for 4 years. It's become a piece of compliance, it's become a piece of legislation, it's become a piece of compliance process in Australia across the higher education sector. And last year, I'm going to get the TEXA, so the Tertiary Education Standards Qualification something in Australia. Oh, there probably is no U. TEXA, TESQA, TEXA, who are the kind of overlords of the higher education and tertiary education sector in Australia. Last year, they were happy to see that Australian universities, all Australian public universities, had some kind of mechanism for recording sexual misconduct on campus. This year, and just last week, the 2021 report was released, and TEXA were a lot less happy because there was still a significant concern about sexual violence still occurring, and some pretty shocking statistics in terms of not just people being, not just the misconduct happening and people being abused or being subjected to unwelcome advances, but actually the lack of people wanting to still report because of the sense perhaps that universities would not provide the kinds of responses, aka care, that they might want. It's a very current example, and I'm sure you've got examples as well. We could think about all sorts of examples here. The decolonial agenda, we could think about responses to, for example, asylum seekers wanting to access education. We could think about the equity piece. We could think about First Nations students in many colonised or countries with settler colonial roots. We could think about many issues that really do not necessarily or rarely have a kind of proactive response. It's unusual for institutions, whether that be government or universities, as a smaller example, to respond without being pushed. So this idea of misfortune necessitating care misrecognises also that everyone needs care. If we only think about it around high status, media fueled campaigns, albeit with absolute need to address these ongoing and endemic issues, if we only think about care happening when someone is at risk or if a group of people are at risk, then care becomes reactive, and it then denies the fact that we're all always embroiled in care relationships, whether we are carers ourselves, whether we care for or whether others care for us. As an institution, we could ask questions about kind of ethical, moral questions about whether universities have a duty of care for staff and students. I think we would all agree that that is the case, but how far does that duty of care go? We can never really fully discuss these questions if we only ever have reactive kind of responses to the need for care. And universities have long divested their assessment of due care to neoliberal technologies, such as student satisfaction surveys or archiving responses in policy libraries in ways that don't then necessarily, or don't then full stop, create the conditions to be able to have rigorous debate or to be able to discuss the kinds of needs that we might have and the ways that we would like our institutions, including universities, to respond. The second sign that an institution is not caring is that the needs are taken for granted by the institution. So universities take it for granted that they know what students and staff need. Or worse, they ignore what students and staff need, and they make decisions about what people want on the basis of what they think is the case. And this is where those assumptions that I spoke about before come out to play. So assumptions about what people need and how they want their needs to be met can be harmful, and if not harmful, can denote a casual ambivalence or even dismissal of people's agentic capacity to feed into the processes and practices and decisions about care. When caring needs to be fixed and kind of planned for or predicted in ways that are quite narrow, it then prompts questions of who gets to decide what care counts and whose interests are being served and therefore whose are not. And it's rarely the case that we have this on an ongoing basis. Joan Tronto wrote that any agency or institution that presumes needs are fixed is likely to be mistaken and to inflict harm. So it's a really damaging proposition to think that an institution or senior managers within an institution can make decisions about what the most, and I want to be careful about using the word vulnerable because I'm going to critique it in a second, but what the people who have the least power in an institution want or need. An institution might rightly question to what extent it can respond to everyone's needs. And I don't think that's what we're talking about. It's easy to make an equality argument to deride and dismiss the needs of people. And that's often, I think, what gets taken up in the equity space, is that we're often talking about equality, so therefore everyone has access to the same, which then fails to recognise that when people join, particularly institutions like universities that are powerful and that have long histories of social reproduction and hegemonic kind of reproduction of particular people getting into particular powerful positions and professions, and then we see that cycle continue. It's really problematic if we base our assumptions about what people need and how to give them what they need on the assumptions of a powerful few. Now, that's not necessarily how it happens. I'm being kind of a little bit naughty by brushstroking it as broadly as I am, but certainly there are challenges. And one of the, I'll speak to this in a moment, but one of the people who spoke to me for the book talked about just endless rounds of consultation. So the sense that universities are asking what people need, but really not paying much attention. There isn't a kind of, they're not necessarily closing the feedback loop, or if they are, it's quite static and it's not possible to go back. It fails to recognise that needs change, and COVID very clearly demonstrated how much needs could change, and for people that we didn't expect to have profound needs in Australia, and I'm not sure if it's the same in South Africa. There was shock that international students were vulnerable, to use that term again, that were needing financial support, because for such a long time the dominant narrative about international students in Australia has been about them being cash cows. And certainly Australia, international students have been Australia's second or third biggest export for many years now. And that's very much the case as well for other Anglophone countries that can modify English language education in the way that countries like Australia do. So the idea that we would take money, this is a big point of critique in the work that I'm interested in, a big point of critique, that we take international students' money as full fee paying students and then fail to give them the kinds of responsive supports that they need, such as language support, not just testing and making sure that someone's got the proficiency levels to get in, but actually then giving them support to go through. The idea that international students were in any way needy was a great shock to the system, and meant that many institutions then had to do knee-jerk reactions, so that kind of reactive care, and it was broadly around offering money. There wasn't much that went beyond that. And it was a very difficult, COVID evidently is still a difficult time and has shifted the parameters in terms of what our needs are and the assumptions we might bring to responding to them. The third sign is that care is seen as a commodity rather than a process, and it certainly is the case, without a doubt, that universities have done a lot of work to justify commodifying and outsourcing care. It's justified under the neoliberal kind of imaginary, and has been increasingly justified under austere conditions that certainly Australian universities are experiencing, or were thought to experience. It actually hasn't been as bad as they thought. One summary of the job losses in Australian universities took it up to about 40,000 staff members across the country, which I think was has been critiqued afterwards, but really was reflective of the high numbers of people who were on casual, precarious contracts who then didn't get any further work. So more smaller numbers, if reported, may not include that largely invisible cohort. So we see care, and here we could talk about care in terms of teaching as a commodity that can be bought, and not even with very good conditions. So Raewyn Connell has written about this in her excellent book about the good university, and wrote about the prevalence of outsourcing in universities. So where care, it needs to be given, and care could be here taken up to mean, for example, cleaning, it could be manning the post office, it could be doing teaching work. The outsourced workers, Raewyn Connell writes, are not at the university long term and have no role in its decision making. It therefore undermines the grassroots coordination of labour process, and it means that they're taken to be contractors rather than ongoing staff, and they're limited or closed out from the kinds of protections that being a staff member offers. So this idea of commodifying care, which is prevalent across the world and isn't a university thing at all by any standard, is deeply unethical and uncaring, and does lead to those really unequal patterns of global inequity with care chains in terms of who's mobile to do the care for others, and who has the power and money to pay for others to do their care. The next sign that institutions are not caring is that care is where care receivers are excluded from making decisions. And from my observation, universities adopt a very paternalistic approach to determining care, and use this kind of determinant of vulnerability, which is very much contested in the refugee literature, for example, because vulnerability suggests a lack of agency, which is very rarely the case. What people often lack is the kind of hot or familiar knowledge that for example, Australian-born students, if I'm thinking about refugee students, that Australian-born students are able to access, or that students with middle to higher social economic status parents or educated parents can bring that others can't. So that's really the premise underneath the widening participation or access agenda. So the idea that some care receivers are vulnerable and therefore can't make decisions or lack judgment when it comes to determining care is really, really problematic, because it closes many people out of the conversation of what care should be given and how. When care is reduced to caregiving, it's also very problematic. Care is much more than giving. Care is a relationship, so caregiving always invokes a sense of care receiving. So when someone is giving care, someone is receiving care, and it's often really complicated in all sorts of ways. It's very much relational, and it's based on a whole set of kind of expectations. It should not be based on that maternal, familial notion of care, although there are elements of that would be useful to pull into the kinds of organisational decisions to create more caring institutions. But caregiving suggests a one-way kind of monologic flow, where actually we're always involved in care relations. And if we only look at caregiving, then it excuses us from thinking about the fact that we are also care receivers, even if at this particular moment in our lives we are not receiving care on a daily basis in that same kind of way. We are always involved in kind of webs of care, and we may always need to receive care. So if we're not kind of pulling that idea that we're all involved in care circles and care relations, and that there are these care flows, it makes it really easy then to kind of hive half of that piece off and take a very tokenistic or instrumental approach to care. I'm nearly finished. Caregivers see organisational requirements as barriers rather than facilitators. And here I go back to that idea of the consultation. So Miles, who was a professor of education in a European university, described how his university has an obsession with consultation. And while the kind of premise behind those consultations will be about consultation, so collaboration and assessing and finding out what people's needs are. The fact that it's perceived as a tick box exercise becomes a barrier, because what Miles went on to say is that actually it means that fewer and fewer people listen, and that really nobody actually has a voice, and that nobody feels like they can make the comment that needs to be made that might start, you know, the discussion or the debate, or take things in a kind of productive but unpredictable way. Certainly this is my experience. I mean, what underpins all of these issues that's come through really clearly in the data that I've gathered from speaking to excellent humans who work and study in universities across the world, is that time is absolutely central. And so, you know, people are always making decisions about what to invest in and what care to give on the basis of a kind of time cost benefit analysis, which means if you overdo the consultation, if it's perceived as tick box, people won't invest their time and energy in doing that, which obviously then devalues the whole process. And the final sign is that care work is distributed along class, gender and ethnicity lines. And, you know, universities are no different from any other organisation, very much implicated in the, I don't know why I'm pausing, they're very much exploitative organisations. We only need to look at the case of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are employed on fixed term, if not precarious, if not 0-hour contract, to do the real care work of the institution, which is teaching and other activities. But the fact that we take what is our core business and the thing that is the beating heart, the relational beating heart of being someone who studies or works as an educator in a university, the fact that we hive that off to make space for research, because that's what can generate more sexy metrics and more money and more reputational currency, is really, for me, one of the things that shows, it's like the canary in the coal mine. It shows that things are really quite sick and that things need to change. So as with all other organisational contexts, care in universities is disproportionately undertaken by women, by people of colour, by migrants, by people from lower SES backgrounds. We see similar patterns in Australian education in terms of the kinds of participation rates in higher education, not just university, but higher levels of further education, but also in the professional distribution where people go. We see it in the ways that the kind of care work, so that kind of people-rich, relational, hard, emotional labour of teaching or social work or nursing is not valued in any way societally or financially or in any really meaningful way, in the same way that we value other things which produce, some would say, artifice, or that produce numbers. So this kind of relational piece, the idea that relational, the care work, the emotional labour can be number one, commodified, and number two, undertaken primarily by people who are themselves already marginalised against the powerful kind of the powerful group. And by that, I'm going to use a reductive label of pale, male and stale. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's pale, female and stale, but even still, we can see that there is still this kind of powerful hegemonic push that means that we can outsource our care, because what we do is we have care passes. And so if we have a care pass, which means that we can buy our responsibility, we can buy someone else, we can pay someone else to take on our responsibility of care. And, you know, I think probably many of us will recognise this. I've certainly paid for childcare, and I've certainly paid for other things that definitely mark me out as someone who really needs to check all sorts of things about the kinds of things I say in public and my critique. We're all imbricated in these kind of care responsibility divestment strategies, because we're able to justify it along the production path line. So I'm busy producing, I'm busy writing a book, I therefore don't want to wash my floors, or I want someone else to look after my kid after school, for example. And certainly there's a power dynamic when care becomes service. So when it's care, the care receiver is the person who has less power, but when it's service, it's the care receiver who has less power. So more power, sorry, because they're paying for the service. So the power dynamic changes whether we see something as care or service. And we need services. It's not to say that everything should be done ourselves or should be done for free, because that wouldn't in any way represent the kinds of world and the economy, the economic kind of imperative that we live with, and certainly not in universities. But we need to be careful what is care and what is service. So are universities caring institutions? Well, I would say they're not wholly uncaring. They certainly are good at ticking boxes and producing a kind of shiny veneer of care. And if they were fully uncaring, we wouldn't continue to work in one. And, you know, I regularly think about checking out, but I don't know where else I would go. But I don't think that universities meet Toronto's conditions of care in institutions. There may be rare examples of institutions that meet some of those 7 signs. But I think instead it would be useful to use what Agnes Bosanquet calls undercaring universities, this idea of undercaring. So they have a veneer of care, they tick boxes, they undertake things like consultations, but they fail to take it through, they fail to close the loop. So it's not relational care, it's not reciprocal care, and it's not proactive care. And so undercare is really kind of the idea that it's care that doesn't follow through. So it's also underpinned by this kind of piece around privileged irresponsibility, and by allowing us to kind of justify not following through because it's an institution. So we can justify it because it's not an individual. We can't attribute sole blame to that one person. It's easy for the blame to kind of diffuse through senior leadership and for things to continue as they were. So we're not really calling out these issues of care. So what counts as good institutional care? Well, according to Joan Tronto, it has 3 elements. It has a purpose. It recognises and works to kind of ameliorate as much as possible power relations. And it sees care, very importantly, as pluralistic and responsive, rather than one size fits all and assumed reactive care. And what this requires is recognition and dialogue, so really true expressions of and debate around what counts as care, and recognising, sorry about the typo there, 2 ofs, that competition and diminutive power really are kind of counter, the antithetical to the idea of care, because they're going to push particular logics that don't really want to consider care. It doesn't benefit the neoliberal project to think about humans at the heart of organisations. There needs to be an agreement of common purpose, and that means going back to that question of whether universities are a public good and having a kind of large-scale international debate about what is higher education. It's morphing, it's always in transition. Increasingly in Australia, our most recent package of reforms that came out last year were called the Job Ready Graduate Package, and that tells you everything you need to know. Universities are very much conceived as employment factories and as sites to produce employable, pliant, creative, global citizens, good communicators, all sorts of things, but without really putting in the supports to actually make that happen. We need to think about good institutional care as being characterised by particularity, so responding to particular needs, and plurality, so seeing multiple needs as needing to be responded to, and ultimately closing that loop, so making sure that we're getting to think about what is the purpose, what power relationships are involved, what's the needs, and then what's the purpose, and continually going around that kind of reflective cycle. What makes this difficult is this idea of care passes and privileged irresponsibility. So the idea that we can buy our responsibility or pay our responsibility off to others. And so what would a caring university look like? This is where I'm a bit stuck, so I'd love some help. Ideally, caring institutions, so this is going back to Tronto's work, ideally a caring university would be open and would support the needs of all individuals, and would secondly offer individuals freedom to choose how to connect with the institution or how to represent themselves and how to manage themselves. A good university would pay its staff, and it would pay them well, and it would produce the kinds of conditions that allow people to thrive and the kinds of supports that can help that to happen, not just for the very privileged few, and I am one of those privileged few, and I'm not really grateful because I continue to slap higher education as much as I can without getting too hurt in response. It's risky to talk about care. That's another thing I'm not going to talk about this evening, but you know, the idea of speaking up and caring in those kinds of more advocacy activism ways carry a big risk. It would be accommodating of all people involved, so staff, students, and thinking about others, and contractors, for example, if that continues to be a mode of operation. It would reward care. It wouldn't ignore it as currently happens. Often I think what happens with care is that it gets taken up by individuals. They'll do it beyond their jobs. It's one term for this is organisational citizenship behaviour, so going the extra mile, but in ways that are not recognised in contracts or salaries or necessarily by managers in ways that are valued. And we don't always need to be valued for everything we do, but we do need to make sure that we're not actually doing the work of an institution to support the students, to support the people who have needs, and then leave institutions off the hook so that they don't then need to bother responding because we as individuals are taking on that responsibility. A good university would have multiple plural particularistic models of care, plural. It wouldn't take a one size fits all. And English, for example, language support, if it's a study skills model, go off to the library or the learning centre or wherever it is and go and speak to a study skills advisor and they'll help you to learn how to write your assignment. That kind of approach serves no one well because it refuses to acknowledge the particularity and the context involved. A caring university would facilitate, would encourage and welcome people in discussing discussing care and also sharing opinions and views and judgments and suggestions. And a caring university really would not ask people to care so much that they cannot engage in self-care. And I think working in a university at the moment, I don't know about you, but I've now got 14 HDR students. I've got a full teaching load. I've got a big research agenda. I've also got parenting duties. I'm a grandma. I've got a partner. I'm a daughter to aging parents, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure this is true of many of us. We all have multiple caring responsibilities, either to be cared for or to give care. And so a good university would not ask us to do so much that we are not able to prioritise self-care. But some of that does also come down to the individual. So my final word on this is that care matters. I'm not sure that care is necessarily the best word for this conversation, and I've tried out some other words such as kindness or compassion or empathy. I think they're all interconnected, and I'm not sure which works best. In the literature, care is taken up very much in the nursing or in the teaching literature, which is great, but it has a particular meaning and it doesn't help us to get to the higher kind of space of higher education as an institution as opposed to disciplines or individuals. And I think really importantly that COVID has shown us that we are desperate for care and connection. Actually, most of us thrive in these conditions of being connected and feeling like we're in caring relationships. And the recognition of this from all institutions and probably especially governments, I can't speak for yours, but certainly for Australia's, should recognise that we all have caring needs, varying caring needs and desires that should be met, and that those are some of the conditions of living a good life. But we need to do it together. And what that looks like, I can't quite tell you. So that's it from me. I will try to stop presenting my screen. I'm working across two screens and doing a very bad job. If anyone can wrestle the screen back off me, you're very welcome. Oh, there we go. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was a very informative and rich presentation. Since we are already short on time, I'm thinking to just pass quickly over to Carmen to say a few words, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions. So if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand or write them down in the chat. Let us know. This is ongoing research. Please remember that when you're posing your questions. So everything is not tied up yet. Carmen?
Thank you, Monique, and thank you, Sally. Thank you very much for a really thoughtful presentation, but especially for bringing this extremely important aspect of higher education to our attention. It is certainly true that, especially in this center, some of us have focused on our work on student experiences from disadvantaged background, and we know caring for these students is essential to resolve some of the many issues we have identified in these institutions. However, your presentation today also brings to our attention the important matter of how we stand in this messy institutional space as workers who care, right? So I believe we will all agree with your argument about seeing and experiencing endemic undercare in higher education. And I appreciate your way of bringing this from an holistic perspective, from an institutional perspective, where we can see the full picture of the logics that underline our universities. I guess what is ironic is that we know and have experienced all these aspects as knowing about students experiencing anxiety to ask questions. Many staff members that are embedded within a hyper-competitive and under-resourced working space, and they become abused at the same time as they are complicit in this exploitation. We know that those workers that cannot continue working unpaid hours are not only unlikely disadvantaged in their own, but in many cases they are forced to leave their careers. And these individualized logics not only impact the local context, dividing the often damaged social fabric, but also penalize the individuals who try to go against it. And as you rightly say in the proposal, in the book proposal, is that success in academia goes against caring. And much of this caring is done as a reactive caring, as you mentioned in today's presentation. So honestly, I believe your work is especially relevant for many of us in South Africa. What your research says about our context, where undercare is certainly more prevalent than caring, is rather obvious. Again, you know, some colleagues, including myself, have been trying to understand what Ubuntu means and how students practice it within our institutions. And we know it's there, but not without challenges. But equally, we have perhaps forgotten or overseen what it means for us as workers, as supervisors, and as researchers, even if not totally. Indeed, it is not that we have not asked ourselves these questions, but what would you do in a context as an individual and not necessarily an institution where you find yourself as a minority, sometimes alone, trying to go against established norms when you are kind of in the middle of being exploited and continuing that exploitation? I'm sure you know this is one of the questions that that is principal or substantial in your work, and I think it worries many of us because our way of understanding research is not only to know and to find out about these things, but rather to also know how we can change and find these ways in which we can contribute to a better world, even if we make mistakes on our paths. So my final questions to you is not only if there is a way we can do better at the individual level, not only at the institutional level, which is the obvious, as much as we know we won't change our institutions and their logics in a month or a week, as you mentioned, but also it relates to other frameworks. And I was especially thinking in Toronto and the emphasis on neoliberal logics. But as you were mentioning at the beginning of your presentation, what about ecofeminist framework and post-colonial frameworks when they warn us that the patriarchal and colonial system maintains exploitative and individualistic logics as part of its own preservation? and care is relegated to unpaid work and feminized, and therefore for capitalist enterprises such as university, there is no space for questioning beyond monetary revenues. So is there therefore a critique beyond the neoliberal critique? And I think, of course, you kind of have answered this, bringing the intersectional approach, but I was wondering, if maybe your research can gain from ecofeminist or post-colonial thinking. And I think linked to that is that my question in terms of, is this caring beyond human beings or also involved caring between humans and natural ecosystems? And finally, I also wonder, what is the relation or difference between individuals and institutions in your study, and how this understanding helps you to research about care? So thank you so much, and all the best writing the book.
Gracias. So I guess I will go to a question there quickly, and then maybe others have got questions, but it's a really difficult question to answer, and I feel like I've taken on way too much with this project because I'm not sure what the answer is. But I do think that the economic arguments can often be subverted and used back against the institutions. So I think, and I consider myself to be on the left of the spectrum, of the political spectrum. I think one thing that people on the left do less well than people in the centre or towards the other end is to use the language of the other. So we see a lot of rhetoric in universities about diversity and inclusion and equity, and it's often used in ways that are higher education marketees. It's used for recruitment. We could do a better job, I think, in making arguments, and when I say we, I think people who care just more generally rather than being a particular political orientation. We could perhaps do a better job of using economic arguments to justify what might have a more socially just or humanistic kind of core, and so that might mean using metrics such as attrition and retention and success to justify the use of funds. And I know for example that a colleague in Australia took this approach and managed to get someone who now works as a kind of ongoing centrally funded refugee advisor at a university. They used a very strong argument about retention and success rather than a social justice or human-based argument. So I wonder if that's something that we could do better, but what the specifics of that look like, I'm not quite sure. I'm confident that collective action is the only way forward, because we can't make significant gains on our own. We end up kind of getting sucked into the organisational citizenship behaviour kind of pattern. And there's lots of great examples. I'm kind of rehearsing. I think that's where I've got to, is we're just recycling great work from colleagues talking about slow scholarship, deliberate kind of boundary policing. And I think self-care is at the heart of this. This is where I started from as well, from suffering several bouts of burnout, and getting to a point where those conversations about self-care have to go beyond the well-being or wellness industry dribble and towards, kind of demonstrating vulnerability. I think I kind of have gone back a bit to bell hooks and the ideas of engaged pedagogy, which is, that you should never ask anyone to be vulnerable, share things that you shouldn't yourself be willing to share and be vulnerable. So I've been very open and vocal when I've had periods of burnout, because I think it's important. And because I'm on an ongoing contract, so I can speak to these things. And certainly there's other really great examples in the literature and in the space about, kind of advocacy and activism for colleagues to try and support various campaigns that might not immediately impact on someone like myself, but would have done for a previous version of myself, or that I know are meaningfully impacting on colleagues at the moment. So things like, better conditions for casual colleagues, for example. But I think it's intractable. I think it's really difficult to kind of pull out clear, silver bullet solutions. It really is an ongoing piece. But I think the question about care going beyond the human and going to the environment is really important, because we've just suffered terrible floods in Australia, and we're only going to suffer more terrible weather events. And so the ideas behind climate change have shifted the narrative, and I think that these are the opportunities, looking out for these kind of moments. That's it. Monique.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Carmen, for that response. At least I think you properly engaged it. We haven't had any questions in the chat, so I think we can close off for today. And thank you again, Sally, for making out time for us. And we'll be sending you the recording in future. The recording will be up on our YouTube channel for everybody to watch again, as I think we will need to go back to this as a resource.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share.